The morning Clark Doyle rode onto Elsie Whitaker's claim, the sun was barely a bruise on the horizon, and she was already standing in the doorway of her canvas tent, with a rifle balanced across her forearm like she had been waiting for exactly this kind of trouble. The year was 1876, and the Dakota Territory was not a place that forgave hesitation. The Homestead Act had been law for 14 years by then, and still men like the one who had sent Clark Doyle came crawling out of the tall grass to take what the law said belonged to anyone willing to work the land. Elsie Whitaker had filed her claim at the land office in Yankton 2 months prior, paid her $14 fee, and driven a stake into the earth herself because there was no man to do it for her. Her husband, Thomas Whitaker, had died of cholera 6 weeks before they were supposed to make the journey west together, and Elsie had made the journey anyway. She was 26 years old, and she had decided that grief was not a reason to stop living. Clark Doyle was 31. He had ridden hard from the town of Granger, which sat 12 miles to the east and served as the unofficial headquarters of a man named Gerald Holt, who owned 4,000 acres of grazing land and believed, with the conviction of the righteous and the arrogance of the wealthy, that he was entitled to 4,000 more. Holt had sent Clark to deliver a message, and if necessary, an eviction. Clark had done this kind of work before. He was not proud of it, but a man had to eat, and Gerald Holt paid in cash. He rode a dark bay horse named Copper, and he kept his hat pulled low against the wind that came raking across the flat prairie like it had a personal grudge. He had the deed transfer papers folded in his inside coat pocket, along with a letter from Holt's attorney in Sioux Falls that outlined, in language meant to sound official and overwhelming, all the reasons Elsie Whitaker's claim was supposedly invalid. Clark had read the papers 3 times on the ride over. He was not a lawyer, but he knew enough to understand that most of what was written there was nonsense dressed up in legal clothing. He pulled Copper to a stop about 20 feet from the tent. The woman standing in the doorway did not step back. She did not raise the rifle, but she did not lower it either. She had dark hair pinned back from a face that was sun-browned and composed, and her eyes were the particular gray of a sky before a hard rain. She was wearing a practical brown dress with the sleeves rolled to her elbows and boots that had seen considerable mileage. "You are on my claim," she said. Her voice was steady. It did not waver and it was not loud. It carried the way a church bell carries, not by force but by clarity. Clark removed his hat. It was a reflex that his mother had drilled into him since boyhood, and it embarrassed him slightly in this context, but he did it anyway. "Ma'am, my name is Clark Doyle. I ride for Gerald Holt." "I know who Gerald Holt is," Elsie said. "Then you know why I am here." "I know why he sent you," she said. "That is a different thing." Clark was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the grass around them with a low, constant sound, and somewhere to the north a meadowlark was singing with absolutely no awareness of the tension below it. He pulled the papers from his coat pocket and held them out toward her. "I have a letter from his attorney. He is claiming that your filing has an irregularity. He says the northeast corner of your stake overlaps with grazing land he has held in use since 1871. Elsie stepped down from the tent's front plank and walked toward him with the rifle still in the crook of her arm. She stopped a few feet short of Copper's nose and took the papers from Clark's outstretched hand. She read them. She read them slowly and completely, and Clark waited, watching her face move through expressions he could not quite name. When she finished, she folded the papers precisely and held them back out to him. "These papers are wrong," she said. "Ma'am, Mr. Doyle, I spent 4 hours at the land office in Yankton with a surveyor and a county registrar before I drove that stake. My northeast corner is 160 acres measured from the stake to the creek. Gerald Holt's grazing use has never been formally registered. Informal use does not supersede a legal homestead claim under the Act of 1862. I suspect you already know that." Clark looked at her for a long moment. He did, in fact, already know that. Mr. Holt can petition the land office if he believes there is a genuine dispute. He is welcome to do that. What he is not welcome to do is send riders to my claim to intimidate me off land that is legally mine. She tilted her head slightly. Are you here to intimidate me, Mr. Doyle? He looked at her eyes, which were direct and entirely unafraid, and he felt something shift in his chest that he did not have a name for yet. No, ma'am, he said, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he meant it. Good, she said. Then you have delivered your message. You may tell Mr. Holt that I have received it and that my answer is no. She paused. You look like you have ridden a long way. There is water at the creek about 300 yards to the east if your horse needs it. She turned and walked back toward her tent. Clark sat on Copper and watched her go, and the meadowlark kept singing, and the wind kept coming, and he found he had absolutely no desire whatsoever to ride back to Gerald Holt. He watered Copper at the creek and let the horse graze for a while in the tall grass along the bank. He sat on a flat rock and looked out across the claim. 160 acres. She had staked it herself. She was living in a canvas tent, which meant she had not yet begun the permanent dwelling that the Homestead Act required within the 5-year proving period. The ground was good here, he could see that. Dark prairie soil, not the thin gray stuff that plagued the higher elevations. The creek was steady, fed from somewhere north where the land broke up into draws and coulees. There was a scatter of cottonwood trees along the bank that would provide lumber if she was careful about how she harvested them. She was going to need a house. The Dakota winters were not survivable in canvas. He was still sitting on the rock when she came to the creek to fill a bucket about an hour later. She did not seem startled to see him still there, which told him something about her. She set the bucket at the water's edge and began filling it. You are still here, she observed. I am, he said. I am thinking. About what? About the fact that you cannot spend a Dakota winter in a tent. She looked up from the bucket. Something flickered in her expression, too fast to read. I am aware of that. Have you started on a permanent structure? I have started planning one, she said carefully. Do you have the lumber? She was quiet for a moment. I have $40. Lumber in Granger is expensive. There are cottonwoods along this creek, he said. I know that. I'm not a fool, Mr. Doyle. I did not say you were, he said, and he was not being polite. He genuinely did not think she was a fool. She was, in fact, one of the most precise and self-possessed people he had encountered in several years of riding through territories where men and women were tested daily by wind and distance and want. I am saying that if you were to cut them strategically, you would have enough for a modest dwelling without destroying the shade or the root system that holds the bank. She looked at him with those gray storm eyes. You know something about construction. My father was a builder in Ohio. I spent my first 15 years handing him tools. He paused, and the last 10 riding through places like this, which I am beginning to think was a waste of a decent education. She picked up the full bucket and stood. She studied him with the same direct assessment she had given Holt's papers. Why are you telling me this, Mr. Doyle? You work for the man who wants me gone. Clark turned his hat in his hands. It was a thing he did when he was working through a thought, and he was aware of doing it and did not stop. I work for Gerald Holt because I need wages. I do not owe him my conscience. He met her eyes. He sent me out here knowing those papers would not hold legal water. He hoped to scare you off before you figured that out. I do not want to be the kind of man who does that. Elsie was quiet for a long time. The creek ran past them both, indifferent and clear. Finally she said, There is coffee in the pot if you want it. And if you mean what you are saying about the construction, I have a shovel that has been sitting idle since I got here because I have not known precisely where to break ground. He looked at her and the corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was something more cautious than that, something that recognized it was standing at the edge of something significant. Show me your survey stakes, he said, and I will tell you where to break ground. She handed him a shovel. He dug her foundation. It was not a simple afternoon's work, and neither of them pretended it would be. Clark rode back to Granger that evening, and he handed Gerald Holt the folded papers and told him that the claim was legally sound, and that any further attempt to displace Elsie Whitaker would need to go through the land office, where it would fail. Holt's face went the color of a bad sunset. He was a large man with a red neck and pale eyes that had the flat quality of a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted without needing to justify it. "I sent you to drive her off," Holt said. "I know what you sent me to do," Clark said. "I am telling you what I found." "You work for me, Doyle." "I work for wages," Clark said, "and I will give back the week's pay if that makes it cleaner." He pulled the coins from his vest pocket and set them on the edge of Holt's desk with a sound that was more final than loud. "The woman has a legal claim and she is not going anywhere. That is the truth of it." He walked out of Holt's office and into the cooling evening, and he stood on the boardwalk of Granger's Main Street and felt something in his chest that was equal parts terrifying and right. He did not sleep well that night. He lay in his rented room at the Copper Kettle boarding house and stared at the ceiling and thought about gray eyes and a woman who read legal papers with the focus of a circuit judge, and who had handed him a shovel like it was the most natural thing in the world, like she had already decided he was trustworthy before he had entirely decided it himself. He rode back to the claim the next morning with his saddlebags full of supplies he had purchased at the general store: 3 pounds of nails, a ball of good twine for squaring corners, an adze that was sharper than the one he had seen leaning against her tent post, and a paper bag of coffee because the pot she had offered him the day before had been almost empty. She was standing at the place he had marked for the foundation when he arrived. She had driven 4 small stakes into the earth in the rough rectangle he had outlined, and she was measuring the diagonals with a length of rope to make sure the angles were square. She was doing it correctly. He watched her from horseback for a moment before she heard Copper's hooves. She looked up. Something moved in her face that was not quite surprise and not quite relief, but something in between. "You came back," she said. "I said I would help," he said. "I meant it." He dismounted and tied Copper to a cottonwood and came to look at her measurements. She had gotten the rectangle nearly perfect. He told her so, and she gave him a look that said she already knew but that she appreciated having it confirmed. He pulled out the nails and the adze, and they spent the morning clearing the rectangle of sod, cutting through the thick root mat of buffalo grass with the blades of their shovels, in a rhythm that was surprisingly companionable for 2 people who had known each other for less than 24 hours. She did not make conversation for the sake of it, and neither did he. But when they paused at midday and she brought out a small pot of beans and some cornbread she had made that morning on her camp stove, they sat on the turned earth and ate and talked, and the talking came easily. She told him about Yankton and the land office, and about the journey from Missouri where she had grown up, and about Thomas, whom she spoke of with a grief that was settled and real, but that had clearly been turned over enough times in her mind that it no longer had the power to undo her. She said Thomas had been a good man, and that she had loved him, and that he would have wanted her to go forward. And she said all of this without asking for sympathy, only offering truth. He told her about Ohio and his father's carpenter shop, and the smell of fresh lumber and sawdust in summer. He told her about the years after, riding through Kansas and Nebraska and now the Dakota Territory, work for one outfit and then another, always moving, never settling. He told it without self-pity, but he heard in his own voice a kind of tiredness, the weariness of a man who had been moving long enough that he had begun to forget why. "Do you miss Ohio?" she asked. He thought about it honestly before answering, which she noticed and appreciated. "I miss the idea of a place that is yours," he said. "The particular way your father's house smells on a cold morning with the stove going. I do not think I can go back to Ohio, but I miss the feeling of that." Elsie looked out over the flat land that stretched in every direction under the enormous sky. "That is what this is supposed to be," she said quietly. "That feeling." In the weeks that followed, Clark fell into a pattern that neither of them formally arranged, but that seemed to arrange itself. He had left Holt's employ and had taken on casual work in Granger, some fence mending for a rancher named Beaumont, some freighting work hauling supplies from the rail depot in Redfield. He paid for his room at the Copper Kettle, and he rode out to Elsie's claim as often as he could, which turned out to be most days. The foundation work moved steadily. They were cutting cottonwoods from the creek bank, choosing the larger dead-standing ones first, and then the smaller live ones with careful selection so the bank would hold. Clark notched the logs with the adze, and Elsie hauled them with Copper and her own small mare, a patient animal named Bess, who had made the journey from Missouri with her, and had the calm, steady temperament of a horse that had seen everything and was no longer impressed by any of it. The people of Granger were aware of what was happening. It was a town of about 400 souls, the kind of settlement that had springs and post office, and 2 churches, and a blacksmith, and a dry goods store, and a strong collective interest in everyone's business. Clark heard the talk. Some of it was benign curiosity. Some of it was the particular kind of disapproval that frontier towns reserved for arrangements that did not fit their expectation of propriety. A single woman and a single man working together daily on an isolated claim. He heard one version of it from the blacksmith, a broad German man named Otto Bauer, who delivered it with the matter-of-fact tone of someone passing on weather information. "People are saying things, Doyle, about you and the Whitaker widow. You ought to be careful how it looks." "How does it look?" Clark asked. Otto shrugged his enormous shoulders and resumed hammering, like a man who left Holt's outfit to go work for a woman who has nothing to pay him with. People wonder about things like that. Clark thought about this. He was not naive about the way frontier society worked. A woman living alone on an isolated claim was already in a vulnerable position. Gossip could do real damage in a way that was slower and harder to fight than any legal paper. He did not want to be the cause of any additional complication for Elsie. He brought it up the next morning while they were fitting the second course of logs on the north wall. He told her what Otto had said, giving it plainly without embellishment or apology, because that was the way she preferred information, and he had learned her preferences quickly. She listened without changing her expression and went on fitting the log into its notch before she answered. "I know what they are saying," she said. "Mrs. Pierce from the dry goods store made sure I knew when I came in for salt last week." "And," he said, she looked at him over the wall of half-built logs. "And what would you have me do, Mr. Doyle? Send you away and spend the winter in a tent?" "I would not leave you to that," he said, "but I want you to know I am aware of it. If there is a way to handle it that does not cause you more trouble, the only way to handle it that causes me no trouble is to finish this house," she said firmly. "A woman alone on a proved-up claim is a respectable thing. A woman alone in a tent is a problem, so let us finish the house." He looked at her for a moment with something warm moving behind his eyes. He nodded and went back to fitting logs. The walls rose through September. Clark taught her the intricacies of corner notching, the way a good half-dovetail joint locked under the weight of the log above it and became stronger as the structure settled. She learned quickly, and with a physical intelligence that he found remarkable, the ability to feel in her hands what was right before her eyes confirmed it. She was strong in a way that was particular to women who had been doing real physical work for years. Not the gymnasium kind of strength, but the functional kind, in her back and her shoulders and the sure grip of her hands. There were evenings when the light went low and gold over the prairie, and they would sit outside the growing walls of the house and drink coffee and talk. And those were the hours that Clark began to understand that he was in very serious trouble where his heart was concerned. He recognized the signs. He had been in love once before in Kansas, with a school teacher named Abigail who had eventually married a farmer with better prospects, and the feeling had been something like this, but quieter. What he felt building in him now around Elsie Whitaker was not quiet. It was the kind of feeling that had a sound like the prairie wind, constant and low and present in everything. He did not say anything. It was too early and the situation was too delicate, and she was still a woman in grief, even if the grief had taken a form that looked like forward motion. He worked. He was careful. He was respectful. and he tried to keep his face from showing too much when she laughed, which she did occasionally, unexpectedly, at something dry and precise, and the sound of it went into his chest like a key into a lock. In the second week of October, Gerald Holt made his second move. Clark heard about it from Beaumont, the rancher whose fences he had been mending. Holt had hired a new man, a former sheriff's deputy from Huron named Prout, who had a reputation for effective persuasion, which was a polite way of saying that Prout was willing to cross lines that more cautious men would not. Holt had also, apparently, found a lawyer in Sioux Falls who believed he could mount a challenge to Elsie's filing based on a technical irregularity in the survey description, a disputed placement of a creek bend marker that Holt claimed had been mislabeled in the county records. Clark rode to the claim that afternoon faster than usual. Elsie was on the roof framework, laying the first of the pole stringers for the roof deck, and she came down the side ladder when she saw the way he was riding. He told her everything Beaumont had said, standing in the shadow of the half-completed walls while Bess and Copper grazed nearby with the contentment of animals who had decided their opinions were not required. Elsie listened. Her face was still and focused. When he finished, she said, "The creek bend marker. Holt is claiming it was misrecorded." "It was not misrecorded," she said with absolute certainty. "I was there when the surveyor measured it. He used a transit and a chain, and the registrar witnessed the measurement. I have a copy of the field notes in my tent." "You have the field notes," Clark said. "I have copies of everything." She went to the tent and came back with a leather satchel that she opened to reveal a collection of papers so organized and complete that it made him want to smile. Survey field notes, the official certificate of filing from the Yankton Land Office, a letter from the county registrar confirming the entry, and a personal hand-drawn map she had made of the claim boundaries with the creek bend marker clearly labeled and notated. "You prepared for this," he said. "I prepared for everything," she said simply. "I came out here alone. I knew men like Gerald Holt existed. I made sure I had everything I needed to fight him." He looked at her with something that was past admiration and moving steadily toward awe. "We should get these documents to Yankton," he said, "or find a lawyer in Redfield who can review them and give an opinion in writing. If Holt is going to file a challenge, you want a legal opinion on record before it gets to a judge." She nodded. "Can you ride to Redfield?" "I can take you to Redfield," he said, and the way he said it was different from just an offer of transportation. It was an insistence, gentle but complete, that he was not going to let her handle this alone. She looked at him for a long moment with those rain-sky eyes. "All right," she said. They rode to Redfield 2 days later, a journey of about 20 miles on a morning that was cool and clear and smelled of the prairie's slow exhale before winter. The journey took most of the day, and they talked the whole way, or most of it, the kind of talking that happened between two people who were discovering that the other one's thoughts were interesting to them, who found the other's perspective worth pursuing, who kept starting new conversations because the previous ones had been so satisfying. He told her about the time he had worked cattle drives through Kansas in the early 1870s, the particular madness and exhaustion of it. 3 months on the Kishom Trail with a crew of 12 men and 2,000 restless longhorns. She told him about learning to read surveyor's maps from a retired engineer who had lived in her town in Missouri and who had taught anyone who was interested, mostly young men who wanted to work the railroads, but also one persistent girl who found maps to be a kind of magic, a way of turning the physical world into something you could hold in your hands and understand. "You taught yourself the law too," he said. "I read everything I could find," she said. "The Homestead Act, the public land regulations, the relevant court decisions. There was a judge in our county seat who let me use his law library when I told him why I needed it." She paused. "Most men assumed I wanted the information for a husband. I let them assume that. Because it was easier. Because the result was what mattered," she said. And there was no bitterness in it, just the pragmatic intelligence of a woman who had learned to work within the world as it actually was while working to change it. The lawyer in Redfield was a small, dry man named Homestead who looked at Elsie's documents with the expression of someone encountering an unexpectedly well-organized problem. He read everything twice and asked several sharp questions that she answered without hesitation. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and looked at both of them over the top of his spectacles. "Your claim is sound," he said to Elsie. "The Creek Bend marker is properly recorded. I can see no legitimate legal basis for Holt's challenge." He paused. "However, if he has a lawyer in Sioux Falls willing to file, even a groundless challenge will take time to resolve. The land office will place the claim in contested status during the proceedings. That does not mean you will lose, but it means delays and expenses." "What is the fastest way to protect the claim?" Clark asked. Hofstede looked at him with the mildly appraising look of a man trying to place him in the story. "Proving the dwelling," he said. "Under the Act, if the claimant has completed a permanent habitable dwelling and established continuous residence, the practical arguments for displacement become considerably weaker even during a contested period. The courts do not like to put people out of finished houses." Elsie looked at Clark. Clark looked at Elsie. The house that they had been building together, the house that was now walls and a partial roof framework and a strong cottonwood log floor sitting on a true dug foundation, was more important than ever. "We need to finish the house," she said. "I know," he said. They rode back to the claim that evening as the sun went down in a conflagration of orange and rose, painting the flat land in colors that had no business being as beautiful as they were. The horses moved at a good traveling pace, and they rode side by side, close enough that their stirrups were nearly touching, and neither of them moved away. "Mr. Doyle," she said at some point in the growing dark. "Clark," he said, "please. We have been digging a foundation together for 6 weeks. You can call me Clark." She was quiet for a moment. "Clark," she said, and the word had a particular quality in her voice that he felt in his spine. "Why are you still here?" He thought about the answer carefully because the question deserved care. "Because I want to be," he said finally. "Because what is happening on that claim is the most worthwhile thing I have been involved in 10 years, and I do not have any desire to be anywhere else." Another silence. The horse's hooves made a steady rhythm on the dry ground. "I am not a burden to be helped," she said quietly. "I need you to understand that. I am not someone who needs rescuing." "I know that," he said. "I am not here to rescue you. You do not need rescuing. You need a second pair of hands with the roof joists, and I have hands." He paused. "And I like being near you. That is also true." The silence that followed was different from the earlier ones. It was warmer. Elsie looked straight ahead at the darkening trail for a long moment, and he could see the line of her profile against the last light, and then she said, very quietly, "I like you being near too." The roof went up in November, which was a race against the first serious winter weather. They worked longer days as the light shortened, and Clark brought in a neighbor from 3 miles up the creek, a homesteader named Lars Eriksson, who was a Swede of immense strength and goodwill, and who had arrived in the territory the previous spring with his wife, Ingrid, and 3 children. Lars helped with the heavy ridge beam, which required 3 people to lift and seat, and Ingrid came along with the children and spent the day making a proper meal in Elsie's camp while the roof went up. And when they sat down to eat that evening in the nearly completed house, it was the first time Elsie had eaten a meal inside 4 permanent walls in months. She sat with a tin cup of coffee and looked at the log walls and the roof above her head, still open in one corner where the chimney would go, and her face had a quality that Clark saw and kept carefully in his memory, the particular look of a person realizing that a dream has achieved physical form. "It is real," she said. "It is real," Lars confirmed cheerfully, spearing a piece of roasted prairie chicken with his fork. "And solid, too. These corner notches are very good work." "Clark taught me to cut them," Elsie said. "She did them herself after the first lesson," Clark said. They smiled at each other across the table with the easy comfort of people who have been through something together, and Lars and Ingrid exchanged a glance above their children's heads that said everything that needed saying without a word. The chimney went up in the following week. Clark had experience with rough masonry from his father's Ohio days, and there was a good source of flat limestone along the creek bank that could be mortared with clay and grit. It was meticulous, slow work, and he spent 3 days on it while Elsie built the interior shelving and fitted the window frames they had ordered from the Granger hardware store, small glass panes that let in the thin November light and made the interior feel like a home rather than a shelter. The first fire they lit in the completed stove was a Sunday afternoon when the temperature had dropped to something serious, and the sky had taken on the particular pewter quality that preceded snow. Clark had just finished pointing the last joint of the chimney and climbed down from the roof to find Elsie standing at the stove with a long match. She looked at him over her shoulder. "You should be the one to light it," she said. "You built it." "We built it," he said. She held the match out to him. He crossed the room, close enough to the warmth of the stove and the warmth of her, and took the match and struck it and held it to the tinder she had laid with the careful precision she brought to everything. The fire caught, small and serious at first, and then growing, and the heat began to come off the iron surface of the stove in waves that felt like something between relief and triumph. They stood side by side watching the fire through the stove's small glass window, close enough that his shoulder was touching hers, and neither of them moved away, and the snow began to come down outside the new window in slow, soft curtains. "Clark," she said. "Yes." "Thank you." She said it plainly, without ceremony, which made it feel more real. Not just for the house, for all of it, for not being the kind of man Holt thought he was sending. He looked at her face in the firelight, the strong line of her jaw and the softness around her eyes that appeared when she was not guarding herself, and he said, "I should be thanking you." "For what?" "For the shovel," he said. "For deciding I was worth trusting before I had entirely decided it myself." She turned her face toward him and their eyes met at a distance of about 8 inches, and the room was warm with the first fire in the new stove, and the snow was coming down outside, and Clark Doyle made a decision that was also, in some sense, not a decision at all, the way the most important things rarely are. He lifted his hand and very carefully, with the gentleness of a man who was aware of the weight of what he was doing, tucked a strand of dark hair back from her face. She did not move away. She turned her face slightly into his hand, just barely, the way a person might lean toward warmth on a cold morning, and he felt that small movement go through him like a sound through still water. "Elsie," he said. "Yes," she said, and that was all either of them needed. When he kissed her it was careful and quiet, the kind of kiss that is not an event but a declaration, something that had been true for some time and was only now being said aloud. She kissed him back with the same steadiness she brought to everything, and when they stepped back from each other the room was warm and the snow was deepening on the prairie, and he was looking at her with everything he felt clear in his face because he had stopped being able to hide it. She looked back at him with those gray eyes, and what was in them was clear too, complex and certain and alive. "We have not known each other very long," she said. "No," he agreed. 3 months. Almost to the day. "My mother would say that is not enough time." "My mother would say that you know when you know," he said. She was right about most things. The corner of Elsie's mouth moved in that way it had, the suggestion of a smile before it fully committed, and then it committed. "She sounds like a sensible woman." The winter settled around the claim with the particular authority of a Dakota winter, which was a thing that required respect and preparation, and the willingness to operate within limitations. Elsie had made her preparations with her usual thoroughness. She had supplies laid in, firewood stacked high along the east wall of the house where it would be protected and accessible, a root cellar that Clark and Lars had helped her dig into the south-facing bank of the creek before the ground froze, filled with preserved vegetables and salted meat and dried beans. Clark continued to ride out from Granger most days, though the rides became shorter in good weather and impossible in bad. On the worst days, when the blizzards came rolling down from the north with a fury that made the world a white wall, he stayed in Granger and worried in a way that was new to him, a specific anxious concern that had a particular face at the center of it. He had made sure she knew what to do, to stay inside, to not go out for any reason in a blizzard, because the flat terrain offered no landmarks and men and women had died 20 feet from their own doors in Dakota winters, because they could not see their hand in front of their face. She survived the blizzards and reported on them to him afterward with the precise observational quality of someone who found the world interesting even when it was trying to kill her. She told him about the sound of the wind in the chimney, a rising and falling note like a badly tuned organ. She told him about the way the snow built against the window until the glass was opaque. She told him about lying in her bed listening to the storm and feeling, for the first time in a long time, something she identified as contentment, the specific warmth of being inside something solid that you built with your own hands. "You were not frightened?" he asked. "Of course I was frightened," she said, "but the house held." In December, Gerald Holt's legal challenge arrived at the Yankton Land Office. Clark rode there with Elsie, and they brought Hofstede's legal opinion from Redfield and Elsie's complete documentation. And the registrar reviewed everything and agreed that the challenge had no substantial basis, but that it would need to be resolved by the land commissioner. The process would take several months. In the meantime, Elsie's claim was technically in contested status, but she was told firmly that this did not require her to vacate, and that her established residence in a completed permanent structure would weigh in her favor. Holt had also, during this period, sent his man Prout to Granger to make it known that Clark Doyle had violated some implied code of conduct by working against his former employer's interests. Prout was a lean, sharp-faced man who communicated his messages through a combination of insinuation and the kind of low-level physical presence that was meant to communicate that consequences were possible. Clark encountered him outside the Copper Kettle boarding house one evening, and they had a conversation that was brief and cold and clear. "Holt says you made your choice," Prout said. "He wants you to know he remembers. Tell Holt his claim against the Whitaker property has been presented to the land commissioner and will be dismissed," Clark said. "Tell him to put his money and attention toward his 4,000 acres of legal land and leave his neighbor alone." He looked at Prout steadily. "And tell him that if Prout or any other rider of his shows up on Mrs. Whitaker's claim, I will be riding to the county sheriff in the morning." Prout studied him with the flat, calculating look of a man measuring odds. Whatever he concluded, he said nothing more and walked away, and that was the last direct communication Clark had from Gerald Holt's employ. Christmas that year came and went with a quiet that Elsie said was the best Christmas she had had since childhood. Clark rode out Christmas morning with a small parcel he had put together in Granger, a good quality iron skillet that had been at the hardware store and that he had seen her admire, and a book of botanical illustrations because she had mentioned once, in passing, that she had always found plants interesting, and that the Dakota territory had a remarkable variety that she could not identify. She gave him a pair of gloves she had made from deerskin, stitched with a precision that told him she had been working on them for some time, lined with rabbit fur, the best gloves he had ever owned. They cooked Christmas dinner together in her new kitchen, a venison roast with dried apples and preserved beans, and Lars and Ingrid Eriksson came in the afternoon with their children, who ran through the house with the exuberance of children who had been contained by weather for several weeks, and the house that Elsie and Clark had built filled with voices and laughter and the smell of good food. And Clark sat at the table and looked around at all of it and felt something so specific and physical that it was almost like pain, the feeling of a man understanding what he has been missing and what he now, with extraordinary luck, might not have to miss any more. He asked her to marry him in January, on a clear cold afternoon when the sky was the deep saturated blue that only appeared in the depths of winter, when all moisture had been driven from the air. They were walking along the frozen creek bank, following the tracks of a fox that had come down from the draw to the north, and he stopped walking and she stopped beside him, and he said it plainly, without rehearsal, because that was what she deserved. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to file a joint homestead entry if the law allows it, and build an additional room on the east end of the house for the winter, and I want to stay here. Not for the winter, not as a hired hand. I want to stay here as your husband if you will have me." She stood in the cold blue air and looked at him with those eyes that always told the truth, and he watched her work through it, not with doubt but with the seriousness of a person who understood that the word yes was a country you could not leave once you had crossed its border. "Clark," she said, "yes. I was not looking for a husband when I came here. I know. I came here to prove my own claim, to show that a woman could do this alone." "I know that too," he said, "and you are doing it. The claim is yours. It will always be yours. I am not asking you to give that up or to make it mine. I am asking if I can be part of what you are building." He paused and looked out over the frozen creek and then back at her. "I have been moving for 10 years. I have not stopped because I have not had a reason to stop. You are the reason." His voice was quiet and even, but what was behind it was everything. "You are the most extraordinary person I have met in my life, Elsie. I love you, and I would like very much to be worthy of you." The wind moved through the bare cottonwoods with a sound like breathing. Elsie Whitaker, who had driven a stake into the Dakota earth alone, and read legal documents in a canvas tent, and cut cottonwood logs and laid them true, looked at Clark Doyle with something in her face that was so unguarded and complete that he felt his heart move like a physical thing in his chest. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Clark." He took her hands in the deerskin gloves she had made him, and she took his hands in her thick wool mittens, and they stood there on the frozen creek bank in the January blue cold, and smiled at each other with the particular helpless joy of two people who have walked into something wonderful and know it. They were married in February at the small Methodist church in Granger, a ceremony conducted by the Reverend Alcott, a thin, kindly man who managed his obvious pleasure at uniting them with professional decorum. Lars and Ingrid Eriksson were witnesses. Ingrid cried, which she said she did at every wedding and was nothing to concern anyone. The few other townspeople who attended, including Otto the blacksmith and his wife, and Homestead the lawyer who had ridden over from Redfield for the occasion, watched with the satisfied look of people who have correctly predicted a happy outcome. Elsie wore her best dress, which was a deep blue wool she had brought from Missouri and had saved for significant occasions, and she had let down her hair and pinned it simply with a pair of ivory pins that had been her mother's. Clark wore a clean suit that he had purchased in Redfield for the occasion, dark gray with a white shirt, and he stood at the front of the church waiting for her, with his hands folded, and his face doing something complicated that resolved into a smile of such complete and transparent happiness when she walked through the door that several people in the congregation exhaled visibly. They said their vows in steady voices and meant every word. The land commissioner's decision on Holt's challenge came through in March. Homestead brought the papers himself, riding out to the claim on a bright muddy day when the first real hint of spring was in the air, the quality of the light changing, the creek beginning to run louder with the upstream snowmelt. The decision was clear and complete. Elsie Whitaker's claim, now jointly held by Elsie and Clark Doyle following their legal marriage and Clark's subsequent filing of intent to contribute to the proving, was found to be properly filed and legally uncontested. Holt's survey argument had been reviewed and rejected. His attorney's arguments had been noted and dismissed. Gerald Holt's response to the decision was not gracious, but it was ultimately limited. He was a powerful man within the county, but he was not powerful enough to override a federal land commissioner's ruling, and he knew it. The last anyone in Granger heard of his interest in the Whitaker claim, he had redirected his attention to a parcel to the west that he believed would serve his purposes better, and where there was no one as well prepared as Elsie Whitaker to resist him. Clark thought about that sometimes, about the person to the west, and felt a thread of unease, but there was nothing he could do about what he did not know, and the claim in front of him was the claim that was his responsibility. Spring on the Dakota prairie was a thing that justified all the suffering that preceded it. The land that had been gray and white and brown for months turned green with a speed that seemed impossible, the grass coming up overnight in thick, soft new growth, the creek running silver and cold with snowmelt, the cottonwoods leafing out along the bank in a pale, delicate green that was the most welcome color in the world after a winter of its absence. Wildflowers appeared in the grass, small and precise and numerous, and Elsie went through the botanical illustration book Clark had given her and identified them one by one with the pleasure of a scholar in a well-stocked library. They planted the first section of the kitchen garden together in April, breaking the dark soil with a garden fork and laying out rows with string and stakes in the same way they had squared the foundation. They planted corn and potatoes and turnips and squash, and a small section that Elsie dedicated to herbs, sage and thyme, and a hardy variety of mint she had brought as seeds from Missouri. Clark built a fence around the garden to keep the deer and the rabbits out, a good tight fence of peeled poles that he was privately proud of, and Elsie planted the beans against the south-facing side of it where they would climb the poles and have the most sun. In May, they broke 20 acres for grain. This was the serious agricultural work of homesteading, the proving that the claim was being cultivated as the act required, and they did it with a borrowed walking plow and Copper and Bess working in tandem, the two horses slow and patient across the heavy prairie sod, turning up the black earth in long dark ribbons that smelled like the world's beginning. Clark walked behind the plow and Elsie drove the horses, calling to them in the low, even voice that both animals responded to with complete trust, and the 20 acres became a field by the end of the first week of May. Lars Eriksson came to help with the planting and brought his oldest son, a 13-year-old named Eric, who was already nearly as large as his father and who worked with serious dedication. They seeded winter wheat in sections and oats in others, and Lars pronounced the ground excellent and the planting well done, and they celebrated the completion of it with a supper at the Eriksson homestead, which had grown considerably since Clark had first seen it and now featured a proper house with glass windows and a barn with a good shingle roof. Ingrid Eriksson cornered Elsie in the kitchen while the men were outside with the children, and Clark, coming in through the side door, heard the tail end of a conversation that he was clearly not meant to hear and retreated immediately, but not before he caught Ingrid's happy question and Elsie's quiet, certain answer, and he stood outside on the Eriksson porch in the warm May evening with his hand on the doorframe and felt something happen to his breathing. When Elsie came out later, she found him sitting on the porch steps looking at the stars, which were out in their Dakota multitudes, more stars than any city person could imagine, the Milky Way a literal river of light across the dark. She sat beside him. "You heard," she said. "It was not a question." "I did not mean to," he said. "I came in for Clark." He turned to look at her. She was watching him in the starlight, and her face was open and a little anxious under its composure, the anxiety of someone waiting to find out how news will land. "How long have you known?" he asked, and his voice was something he was not entirely managing. "About 3 weeks," she said. "I wanted to be sure." He reached out and took her hand and held it and sat with it for a moment because he needed a moment, and she understood and gave him the moment. Then he said, "I am so glad," and she heard every layer of what he meant by it, and she turned into him, and he put his arm around her, and they sat on the Eriksson porch under the Dakota stars, while the sound of Lars and the children carried on the warm air from somewhere around the back of the house. "Are you frightened?" he asked, thinking of the journey west, of the hard physical work, of the isolation that the claim required. "A little," she said honestly. "Are you?" "Yes," he said. "Absolutely yes." He pressed his lips against her hair. "But we have built things before." She made a sound that was half laugh and wholly warm. "We have." Their son was born in December of that year, a cold, clear evening when the first real winter had come back to settle its accounts, and Lars Eriksson rode for the midwife in Granger while Clark sat in the house he had built and was very nearly useless with anxiety. The midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Foley who had delivered most of the children in the county, arrived in time and directed him firmly to the other side of the wall and told him to make himself useful by keeping the stove hot and the water ready. Instructions he followed with the focused desperation of a man grateful to have instructions. The boy was born healthy and considerable, with a voice that left no question about the strength of his lungs, and when Mrs. Foley finally let Clark through the door and he saw Elsie holding the child, exhausted and flushed and entirely capable, she looked up at him with an expression that he carried for the rest of his life with the care you give something irreplaceable. "Come and see him," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, who was red and opinionated and entirely new, and felt the world reorganize itself around this new fact with an adjustment that was both overwhelming and completely right. "What shall we call him?" Elsie asked. Clark thought about it. "Thomas," he said, "if that is all right with you." She was quiet for a moment, and then she looked at him with the particular quality that was always specific to the moments when he surprised her, and she said, "Yes, Thomas." Thomas Doyle was a good baby, which Elsie said with the determined optimism of a first-time mother, and Clark said with the genuine surprise of a man who had expected chaos and found that the chaos, while real, was the most purposeful thing he had ever been in the middle of. The house, which had been designed for two, needed expansion. Clark had planned for this. He had the materials laid in from the fall, and in the spring, when Thomas was 3 months old and the ground was workable again, he built the eastern room he had promised, a proper room with a wood floor and a window that faced south, and the warm light of it made the room the best room in the house when the sun was in the south. The homestead continued to develop in the way that good land and steady work produce. Their wheat was sold in Granger and produced enough to reinvest in seed and more tools, and the hire of Lars Ericsson's son Eric for a week's assistance in the summer. The garden expanded. Clark built a proper barn in the second summer, working with Lars and Eric over the better part of a month. A barn with room for 4 horses and a grain storage bay, and a loft for hay that was large enough to last through the longest winter. The horses that came to fill that barn, 2 additional draft horses purchased at auction in Redfield, were named by Thomas, when he was old enough to have opinions on the matter, George and Hector, names that Thomas chose from a book of Greek stories that Elsie read to him in the evenings. Thomas was a child who combined his father's physical capacity with his mother's precision of mind, a combination that produced in him a particularly competent kind of person who could both lift heavy things and explain exactly why they needed to be lifted. He was curious about everything. He followed Clark through the barn and the fields and the workshop asking questions that were serious and specific, and he followed Elsie through the garden and the kitchen and over the claim with the same serious attention, absorbing the world with both hands. He was 4 years old when his sister arrived. They named her Margaret, and she had Elsie's gray eyes and Clark's dark hair, and an opinion about everything from the first week of her life. Thomas, who had been the sole occupant of the world's attention for 4 years, adjusted to her existence with a philosophical generosity that made both his parents quietly astonished. He examined her with the focused interest of a naturalist encountering a new specimen, declared her satisfactory, and proceeded to treat her with the protective seriousness that characterized everything he did. Holt's name passed through Granger occasionally in those years, but his attempts on neighboring claims met with varying results, and his legal and practical resources were spread thin by his own ambitions. By the time Thomas was 6, Holt had largely ceased to be a presence in the surrounding territory, having overextended his grazing operations to the point where managing what he had required all his attention. Clark heard this from Beaumont, who had remained a source of reliable news about the region's affairs, and he told Elsie, and they sat together over supper that evening with the comfortable ease of people who have been through something together and have come out the other side. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked him once in the 5th year of their marriage. They were sitting on the porch they had added to the south face of the house the previous summer, a good porch with a railing and 2 chairs, and a view of the garden and the fields beyond it, and the creek's line of cottonwoods on the horizon. The evening was warm, and the sound of the children's voices carried from inside the house where Ingrid Eriksson had come to visit, and the children were occupied with whatever complicated enterprise had absorbed them. "Regret what?" he said. "Riding away from Holt, leaving the work you had, coming back here with a shovel." He looked at her, and the evening light was on her face, a few threads of silver now in the dark hair, and the lines at the corners of her eyes that came from years of squinting into the prairie sun, and from years of the particular expression she made when she was trying not to smile, and she was everything. She was the most particular and complete thing in his life and in the world as he understood it. "No," he said, "I do not regret a single day of it. Not even the blizzard of 1879 when the north wall joint split, and we spent 3 hours in the dark rechinking it with frozen hands. Not even that," he said, "although my opinion of that particular evening was different at the time." She smiled fully with no hesitation, and he reached over and took her hand where it rested on the chair arm and held it the way he had held it for years now, with the ease of long habit that was also, still, a specific and conscious pleasure. "I do not regret any of it either," she said. "I want you to know that. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if you had simply delivered Holt's papers and ridden away." "I almost did," he said. "I know. I could see you considering it, sitting on that rock by the creek. You were watching me." "Of course I was watching you," she said. "You were a strange man on my claim who had just been told clearly to leave and was not leaving. That requires watching." He laughed and she laughed, and the sound of it went out into the evening and mixed with the sounds of the prairie, and the children's voices came from inside the house, and somewhere along the creek a meadowlark was singing in the long light. The claiming years were proving years in both the legal and the more personal sense. By the time the 5-year period of the Homestead Act was complete and Clark and Elsie filed their final proof, presenting themselves at the land office in Yankton with their documentation complete, and their dwelling improvement evident, and their cultivation records in Elsie's meticulous hand, they had something far more substantial than the legal minimum. They had 160 acres of proved-up Dakota land, a house that had grown from a rough log structure to a proper dwelling with planed interior walls and a separate kitchen lean-to, and a root cellar and a well, a barn with 4 horses and a milk cow named Agnes, 25 acres in grain, a kitchen garden that was the envy of their neighbors for its productivity, a name in the county for quality wheat, and 2 children who had been born on the claim and belonged to it in the way that children belong to the land they have grown up on, entirely and permanently. The land commissioner in Yankton that day was a different man from the one who had handled the Holt challenge, a younger man named Harper who reviewed their documentation with professional briskness and signed the final certificate of title with a pen that scratched loudly in the quiet office. "Mrs. Doyle," he said, looking at the certificate before handing it over. "Formerly Whitaker, original claimant." "Yes," Elsie said. "This is an excellent proof," he said, and he meant it as a professional observation rather than a compliment, but it was both. "The cultivation records are the most complete I have seen this term." "My wife is thorough," Clark said. Elsie took the certificate from Harper's desk and looked at it. Her name was on it first, as the original claimant, as she had insisted and Clark had fully supported. Clark Doyle was named as co-claimant and co-holder. The land description was exact and complete, every survey reference in its place. She folded it with the same careful precision she had given every important document, and she put it in the leather satchel she had carried since before Clark had ever laid eyes on her. They walked out of the land office into the Yankton afternoon, which was warm and blue and full of the ordinary noise of a working frontier town, wagons and voices, and the distant sound of a piano from some establishment that was not entirely respectable at this hour of the afternoon. Clark put his hat on and they stood on the boardwalk together, and Elsie looked up at him with that face he knew so completely. "It is ours," she said. "It always was," he said. She tucked her arm through his, and they walked down the Yankton boardwalk to find the children, who had been left with a firm young woman named Rose who worked at the boarding house where they were staying the night, with instructions to take them to the park along the riverbank and keep them occupied, instructions that Rose had undertaken with the competent cheerfulness of someone who liked children and who had been well paid. Thomas and Margaret were discovered exactly where expected, at the riverbank watching the Missouri River move past with the indifference of something that had been moving since before anyone had a word for it. Thomas was identifying birds. He had a small notebook that Elsie had given him for exactly this purpose, and he was recording the name and description of each species he spotted with the systematic devotion of a field naturalist. Margaret was in the water up to her knees in a way that was precisely what Rose had been specifically asked to prevent, and Rose was watching her with the resigned expression of someone who had discovered that instructions and Margaret Doyle were entities that operated independently of each other. "Margaret," Elsie said. Margaret, who was 7 years old and had opinions about everything including her own shoe placement, turned and looked at her mother with those gray eyes set in a face that had been arguing with authority since birth. "There are small fish," she said. "Rose would not look at them." "Your shoes," Elsie said, "are in Rose's hand," Margaret said, which was accurate. "I took them off before I waded. I was careful." Clark made the sound in the back of his throat that was not quite a laugh, and was not quite approval, but was somewhere in the territory of both. Elsie gave him the look that acknowledged this was his contribution to Margaret's character, and that she had documentation if it was ever disputed. Thomas came over from his bird-watching station with his notebook tucked under his arm. "Mother, I saw a western meadowlark. I could not see it clearly, but I believe it is the same species as the one at the creek at home." "Very likely," Elsie said. "It is the state bird of several territories." Thomas wrote this down immediately with the small stub of pencil he kept attached to the notebook with a piece of string, which was a system he had devised himself, and which Clark privately considered to be one of the better engineering solutions he had encountered. They collected Margaret from the river and restored her to her shoes and walked to the hotel for supper, all four of them together on the Yankton boardwalk with the river smell on the air and the evening coming on. And Clark walked beside his wife with her arm in his and his children ahead of him on the boardwalk. And he had that feeling again, the one that had visited him first on Christmas Day in the new house, the feeling of a man who has arrived at the place he was always going toward. The feeling of fullness and rightness that is the best thing a life can produce. Supper was good. Thomas ate with the serious application he brought to everything, and asked the hotel owner a series of questions about the Missouri River that the man answered with increasing respect. Margaret ate with one hand and drew with the other on the back of a paper she had found in her coat pocket, drawing something that she said was the fish in the river, which looked like the fish in the river the way a dream looks like its subject. Clark ate and listened to his family and said little because the listening was enough, more than enough. After supper, when the children were in their bed in the room above and the hotel had settled into its evening sounds, Clark and Elsie sat in the small sitting room off the lobby with 2 cups of coffee and the comfortable silence of 2 people who had been together long enough that silence between them was as companionable as speech. Elsie had the certificate of title out again. She was looking at it in the lamplight, and Clark watched her without speaking. "I keep thinking about the first day," she said. "Standing in the tent door with the rifle. I was fairly certain you were going to shoot me," he said. "I was not going to shoot you," she said. "You took off your hat. That saved me." "It surprised me," she said. "Men who take off their hats at a woman with a rifle are not usually there to do harm. She looked at him with a smile that was slow and warm and entirely hers. "I was still prepared to shoot you if you proved me wrong. I have never taken my hat off faster in my life," he said. She laughed, and he leaned toward her and put his arm around her on the small settee, and she rested against him with the easy naturalness of long practice. And the lamplight moved on the walls of the sitting room, and outside the window the Missouri River went on moving in the dark, immense and indifferent and old. "What do you want to do with the next 5 years?" she asked. "More of this," he said, "more of exactly this. The grain acreage could be expanded," she said. "Lars says the market is going to improve as the railroad extends further west. If we break another 30 acres in the north section, Elsie—" "Yes, tomorrow," he said gently. "The north section will still be there tomorrow." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Yes, it will," and she sounded amused and a little sheepish and entirely lovely. They were quiet together for a while, and the hotel settled around them, and the night went on outside. Clark thought about the road from Granger that he had ridden in both directions, toward the claim and away from it, and how there had been a specific morning when away had stopped being an option that made sense to him. He thought about a shovel handle in his hands and the smell of turned earth and a woman who had trusted him before he had finished earning it, who had looked at him over the edge of a document that could have been his excuse to leave and had offered coffee instead, who had handed him a shovel and changed the course of everything. "I want to build something else," he said. She turned her head to look at him. "What?" "The house has room for the children now and not a great deal of extra," he said. "If we are going to break 30 acres in the north section, we are going to have more work than the two of us, and Eric Erickson 1 month of the year can manage well. I was thinking about a second barn, maybe a bunkhouse." He paused. "And a porch on the north side for the summer evenings." She was looking at him with that expression, the one that was fond and assessing in equal measure. That meant she was figuring out whether she was being managed or whether he simply thought of things in terms of construction. "A porch on the north side," she said. "The north porch would face the long view up the creek," he said. "In the evenings in summer when the light comes from the west, that is the finest view on the property." She thought about this. "That is true," she said. "I would like to sit on it with you," he said. "When the children are in bed and the day is done, I would like to sit on it and watch the creek in the evening light." She looked at him for a long moment with those gray storm eyes that had never once in their years together been anything less than entirely honest with him, and she said, "Yes, Clark, build the porch." He built the porch the following summer, a good porch with a solid railing and 2 chairs, and a view up the creek that in the long summer evenings, when the light fell sideways from the west and gilded the cottonwood leaves, and turned the water to something that looked like hammered brass, was exactly as fine as he had promised. They sat on it together on the evening he finished it, the children asleep inside, the claim quiet around them in the way the Dakota prairie got quiet in the summer dusk, full of small sounds, the creek and the grass and the night insects beginning their business, but with a quality of peace over it all that was specific to open land at the end of a long day. The wheat was good that year. The north section was broken and seeded. Thomas could name every bird that came to the creek and had begun teaching Margaret the system, and Margaret had started applying her drawing ability to the botanical illustrations in a way that showed she had inherited something of her mother's precise observation. Eric Erickson was going to help with the harvest. Lars and Ingrid were expecting their 4th child, and the Ericksons and the Doyles had become the kind of families that did for each other without keeping score, the way good neighbors on the frontier had to be to survive. Clark looked out at the creek in the evening light and then at his wife beside him, and she was looking at the creek too, and her face had the quality of the face of someone who is exactly where they intended to be. "5 years ago," he said. "Almost exactly," she said. "I rode onto this claim to drive you off it," he said. "You handed me a shovel." She looked at him and she was smiling. "You dug the foundation," she said. "I dug the foundation," he agreed. She reached over and put her hand on his, and they sat together on the porch he had built, on the claim she had filed, in the house they had built together from cottonwood logs cut along the creek and foundation stones lifted from the earth by both their hands, and the prairie lay around them in every direction under the immense Dakota sky, and the evening was warm and endless and entirely theirs. The years that followed were years of building, of the steady, purposeful kind that comes when two people have agreed on what they are building toward and are willing to do the work to get there. The north section produced its first harvest, and it was good, a solid yield of winter wheat that Clark hauled to the elevator in Granger in 2 trips with the team of draft horses Thomas had named George and Hector. The money from that harvest paid for new equipment, a proper cast-iron range for the kitchen that Elsie had been managing without for 2 years, and that transformed the cooking in ways that seemed almost miraculous after the camp stove. Thomas was 9 when the territory became an issue of national conversation. The discussions about statehood that were rolling through the Dakota Territory in the late 1880s with the inevitability of weather. The year 1889 brought what everyone had been expecting, the division of the Dakota Territory into North and South Dakota, both admitted to the Union as states on the 2nd of November of that year. Clark heard the news at the general store in Granger and rode home to tell Elsie, and she sat for a moment with the particular stillness that meant she was absorbing something significant. "We are in a state now," she said. "South Dakota," he said. "We are South Dakotans." She considered this with the same precision she brought to everything. "The land laws will not change significantly," she said, which was her way of engaging with the practical implications before the emotional ones, a characteristic Clark had long understood and found entirely endearing. Then she said more quietly, "But it is something, isn't it, to be part of a state?" "It is something," he said. They drove the wagon to Granger that evening for the celebration that the town had organized, and Thomas and Margaret were wide-eyed at the torchlight, and the noise, and the particular exuberance of a frontier community that has been waiting for recognition for a long time, and is finally receiving it. Clark lifted Thomas onto his shoulders so the boy could see over the crowd, and Elsie held Margaret's hand and watched the firelight on the faces of the people she had spent 5 years becoming neighbors with, and there was something in her face that was beyond satisfaction, a quality of arrival that was different from and bigger than any individual accomplishment. The statehood celebration also produced something less celebratory. In the crowd that evening, Clark saw Gerald Holt for the first time in years. He was older, heavier, still carrying the air of a man who believed the world owed him more than it had so far delivered. Their eyes met across the crowded street for a moment, and Clark kept his face neutral and steady, and Holt looked away first. That was all it was. No words, no confrontation. Just 2 men who had stood on opposite sides of something important, one of whom had chosen to stay on his side of it, and the world had moved on. He told Elsie about it afterward, walking back to where they had left the wagon. She listened and was quiet for a moment. "Is that the end of it?" she asked. "I think so," he said. "A man who looks away first has made his decision." She nodded and took his arm, and they walked on through the cold November night with their children ahead of them on the boardwalk. And that was, as far as Clark could ever determine, the last time Gerald Holt was any kind of presence in their lives. The following spring Elsie discovered she was expecting again. She told him on a March morning over breakfast in the kitchen with the new cast-iron range throwing good heat and the smell of coffee in the warm air. And she told him the way she told him important things, directly and without performance, watching his face. His face did what it did, which she always said was one of his best qualities, that his face did not lie. He looked at her across the kitchen table and felt that reorganization again, that adjustment of the world around a new fact, but this time it came with the additional warmth of knowing exactly what followed it, the specific and extraordinary experience of a new person arriving in a life you had already committed everything to. "Is that good?" she asked, which was not really a question. "That is very good," he said. Their second son arrived in October, a fine crisp Dakota fall when the cottonwoods along the creek were turning gold, and the air had the particular clarity that comes before the first real frost. They named him James, and he was small and certain of himself from the beginning, with Clark's dark hair and Elsie's directness of expression. Thomas received him with the now-practiced equanimity of a child who had navigated the arrival of one sibling and understood the basic shape of the experience. Margaret was 11 and immediately proprietary, declaring James to be hers in a way that she also declared most things, with an absolute conviction that the universe would need to work quite hard to argue with. James was 3 months old when Elsie sat down one evening with a pen and her good paper and wrote a letter to the county land office, suggesting that the office might benefit from a formal pamphlet explaining the Homestead Act filing requirements in plain language, particularly as it applied to women filing independently, a provision of the law that was known to many lawyers and few actual homesteaders. She had been thinking about this for years, she told Clark, and now that she had time in the evenings while James nursed, she was going to do something about it. The pamphlet was written over the course of a winter, and the county land office accepted it the following spring with the slightly surprised gratitude of an institution that has received an unexpected gift of quality, and it was printed and distributed to new claimants for years afterward. Clark learned about the distribution of the pamphlet from Homestead in Redfield, who told him with obvious pleasure that he had recommended it to several of his clients, and found it clearer and more accurate than some of the official government publications. When Clark told Elsie what Homestead had said, she was in the garden, and she received the information with a nod that was not false modesty but genuine focus, the focus of someone already thinking about what came next. Then she looked up at him with a smile. "I am thinking about a second pamphlet," she said, "about water rights." "Of course you are," he said, and he said it with the particular affection that had accumulated over years of knowing her, the affection that was made of specific things, the sight of her at her writing desk with complete concentration, the sound of her explaining a legal principle to a neighbor's wife who had come to ask about a boundary dispute, the feeling of her hand in his on the north porch in the evening. The north porch had become exactly what Clark had promised, the best place on the property in the summer evenings. They sat there most nights when the weather allowed, after the children were in bed, and they talked about the day's work and about things they had read and about the children and about the farm and about everything and nothing, the way people talk who are comfortable together and find the other's company genuinely interesting after years of having it available. When Thomas was 12, he began helping with the serious farm work, taking on the morning chores with a reliability that Clark found remarkable and told him so. Thomas received this information in the manner of a person who already knew it and was filing the confirmation away. He was going to be like his mother, Clark thought, that particular quality of precision and certainty, and also like his grandfather back in Ohio, the carpenter's son in him, the way he understood how things fit together in the physical world. Margaret at 14 was reading everything she could reach, which in the Doyle household was a considerable library by frontier standards. Elsie had accumulated books over the years with the systematic intent of someone building an essential infrastructure, and Margaret was moving through them with a speed that alarmed and delighted both her parents. She had also taken over the botanical records that Elsie had started, expanding them into a proper ledger that now covered every plant species she had identified along the entire length of the claim's creek frontage. James was simply James, a sturdy small boy who wanted to know how everything worked and took things apart to find out, a tendency that had cost them 2 perfectly functional clocks, but had apparently taught James something valuable because he had put both of them back together in working condition, which Clark privately considered to be more interesting than the initial damage. The claim had proved itself. The 5-year proving period was long completed, and the title was clear and registered and undisputed. The land had produced wheat for 10 years, and the soil remained good, managed with the rotation and rest that Elsie had read about and implemented from the beginning. The barn was full and the well was true, and the house had grown with the family, room by room. Each addition built the same way as the original structure, with attention and intention, and the particular care of people who understood that what they were building was meant to last. On an evening in the summer of their 12th year on the claim, Clark and Elsie sat on the north porch in the long light, and the children were somewhere on the property doing the specific things they did. Thomas somewhere along the creek with his field notebook, Margaret in the barn with Agnes, the milk cow who had been replaced twice since the original Agnes, but who carried the name forward as a kind of honor to the first one, and James in the workshop where Clark had set up a workbench for him, taking something apart that would presumably be put back together by morning. The light was as Clark had promised it would be all those years ago, gold and sideways from the west, laying itself along the grass and the water with the generosity of a long summer evening in the high plains. "Do you remember what Hofstede said?" Elsie said. "When we first came to see him in Redfield, he said the practical arguments for displacement became considerably weaker if the claimant had established a permanent habitable dwelling." "I remember," Clark said. "I think about that sometimes," she said. "How much of our lives we have built since that morning." He looked out over the claim, the fields and the garden and the barn and the creek and the cottonwoods that were taller now than when he had first cut among them with an adze, the ones they had left grown full, the ones they had cut replaced by new growth along the bank. The land looked like itself and also more than itself, the way things look when they have been tended well for a long time. "I think about the shovel," he said. She looked at him. "What about it?" "The weight of it," he said. "That first morning. You handed me a shovel and it weighed exactly what a shovel weighs, but it felt like something considerably more significant." "It was a shovel," she said, but she was smiling. "It was a decision," he said. "You had decided something about me before I had decided it about myself." She was quiet for a moment. The evening moved around them in its sounds. "I had been paying attention," she said. "Since you took off your hat, I was paying attention to everything." "And what did you see?" he asked. She looked at him with those gray eyes that were the same as the day he had met her and also entirely different. The difference that came from 12 years of shared experience and trust, the way a landscape changes when you know it well. "A man who was better than the job he had been sent to do," she said simply. "A man who took off his hat." He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, the same way he had taken it on the Erickson porch on the night he found out about Thomas, the same way he had held it in the cold on the frozen creek bank, the same way he had held it in the Yankton land office on the day the title came through, the same way he had held it most days of their life together on this claim, with a grip that was both habitual and entirely intentional, the grip of a man who intended to keep holding on. The sun went down in its slow and extraordinary way over the Dakota prairie, taking its time about it the way the sun does in high summer, lavishing the sky with color in stages that moved from gold to orange to rose to the particular bruised purple of the last light, the colors coming and going over the flat horizon like music. From the workshop came the sound of James finding out how something worked. From somewhere along the creek came the sound of Thomas identifying a bird in the last of the light. From the barn came Margaret's voice talking to the cow in a reasonable and direct way, the way her mother talked to things that needed to be understood. The house stood behind them, solid on its foundation, the cottonwood logs of its walls settled and certain after more than a decade of wait. The foundation Clark had dug on that first morning was the foundation of the house, and also of everything else, the thing you could not see but that held everything above it up. The chimney that Clark had built from flat limestone carried the smoke of 10 years of winters. The well they had dug together in the second year drew water from the same source that had fed the claim since before either of them was born. Elsie leaned her head against Clark's shoulder on the north porch in the last of the summer light, and he put his arm around her, and they watched the prairie dark coming in from the east, the stars appearing one by one above the horizon in the way they did every night, with the reliable and enormous beauty of things that do not need to be anything other than what they are. "Do you want more?" she asked. "More what?" he said. "More of anything," she said. "More acres, more building." "More no," he said, and he meant it the way he had meant the most important things he had ever said, from the bottom and without remainder. "I have everything." He pressed his lips to her hair, which smelled like summer and work, and the particular combination of lavender soap and prairie wind that was entirely and specifically her. "I have had everything for a long time." She was quiet against his shoulder in the way that was agreement and contentment, and the deep peace of a person who has built something real and knows it will stand. The Dakota night came on around them, clear and enormous and full of stars, and the claim lay around them in every direction in the dark, all 160 acres of it, proved up and titled and cultivated and tended. The land that she had staked alone, and that they had worked together, and that had given them a life that was exactly what a life on the frontier was supposed to be when it went right, when the land was good, and the people on it were equal to what the land required. Clark Doyle, who had ridden onto this claim 12 years before with papers meant to drive a woman off the land she had legally and fairly claimed, sat on the north porch of the house he had built on the foundation he had dug on the morning she had handed him a shovel, and he held his wife's hand in the dark, and the stars came out above South Dakota in their multitudes, and the meadowlark that had been singing on that first morning was gone now, replaced by a dozen generations of descendants who sang the same song from the same creek and the same grass with the same indifference to the human story happening below them, which was the way of meadowlarks and also, Clark thought, perhaps the correct perspective on things. But the human story was what it was. It was this: the house, the family, the land, the woman who had looked at him over a document that could have sent him away and had offered coffee instead, the foundation and everything built upon it, the whole of it, real and solid and warm, and his and hers and theirs. From inside the house, James called out with the particular triumph of a small boy who has understood how something works. And Thomas came back along the creek path with his notebook under his arm, and Margaret came from the barn with the evening milking done, and they came to the house, and the light was on inside, and the family was all of them, and Clark and Elsie came in from the porch and closed the door against the night. The stars went on above South Dakota in their hundreds of thousands, old and indifferent and beautiful, looking down on 160 acres of good black soil that had been asked for and earned and proved and would be passed in time to Thomas, who would manage it with precision, and to Margaret, who would know every plant that grew on it by name, and to James, who would understand exactly how it worked, the earth and the water and the stone foundation and everything built upon it. The claim endured. The love endured. That was the whole of it, and it was more than enough.